Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show with a special segment about disabilities within occupied territories. And we're going to talk more specifically about occupied Kashmir as well as occupied Palestine and the challenges that disabled people within both of those regions face. Now, of course, I'm not an expert in this, and that's why we do have the esteemed panelists on today who will shed light for the rest of us exactly about what the challenges may be, but what one can expect that the challenges do revolve around basic things like healthcare, education, employment, etc. And I'm sure there are significant other factors as well which would need to be highlighted as well. Now, the occupations certainly then create further challenges, right? So we have challenges anywhere in the world when it comes to disability rights anyhow, but then within an occupied territory, it's made that much worse because of then restrictions put in place by the respective occupiers. In this case, we can talk about, of course, Israel when it comes to occupied Palestine. Let's now introduce our panelists who are joining us. We're joined by Maysoon Zayid, who is a Palestinian-American disability advocate. She's also a comedian and actress. She's joining us this morning from New York. Joining us from Doha is Nawaal Akram, who is a Kashmiri disability rights campaigner. She's also a comedian, model, and athlete. Nawaal and Maysoon, thank you very much for taking your time out this Saturday to join us. Maysoon, I'd like to start with you. I know that you've worked on the ground in Palestine through a foundation that you had called Maysoon's Kids that ran from 2003 to 2012. So I'm just wondering if you could, just for the sake of those of us who aren't able to appreciate the challenges within occupied territories for disabled children and adults, just tell us a little bit of your experience of what you felt on the ground while you were there for this project.
First of all, thank you so much for having us on to talk about this subject. Disability itself is so rarely spoken about, so I really appreciate this opportunity. I want to start by saying Palestinians were actually very progressive on disabilities prior to the violent occupation. The Helen Keller School for the Blind in Jerusalem was a prototype. It was a beacon for other disabled schools worldwide. But once you have a violent oppression, an apartheid that denies freedom of movement, freedom of education, and freedom of access, of course, disabled people are going to suffer disproportionately. So I'd like to begin with the fact that often disabilities are being caused in these areas. It can be caused by a lack of access to maternal health care. It can be caused by checkpoints that stop women from getting access to a healthy delivery. And of course, it can be caused by children and men who are targeted, shot in the knees, shot in the eyes, to disable and not to kill. And often we focus on the numbers of the dead, and we forget that every single violent massacre creates additional disabled people. But when we talk about disabled kids in Palestine, I have to tell you, the myth that Arabs don't love their children, use them as human shields, consider disabilities a curse, is simply not something I've observed. Palestinian parents want their children to get services. They want them to excel, and they want them to get treatment. But when you are living in Gaza, you have no access to treatment. You have no access to medications. And I want your audience to imagine for a second, what is it like to be autistic in Gaza with bombs dropping all over you? We cannot control as neurodivergent people how we react to that type of stimulus. How, as a child with Down syndrome, do you survive 4 wars by the time that you're 12? So all other disabilities aside, the Palestinian people have PTSD. They have spent a lifetime being stripped of their humanity and bombed to the ground. So disability intersects with every community. And when a community is oppressed, they suffer disproportionately.
All right, Nawaal, let me bring you into the conversation too then. Tell us about your knowledge of, I know you have connections within Occupied Kashmir. I would imagine that a lot of the challenges that disabled people within Occupied Palestine face are the same challenges within Occupied Kashmir as well, vis-a-vis access, as well as the fact that many are then made disabled as well by Indian forces.
So one thing for people to remind that these are open air prisons. There's curfew, there's restrictions on checkpoints on where you can go. So if you're going for an appointment, and keep in mind that doctors and educators are being locked up, they're being jailed under the Safety Act. So people who have the knowledge and the profession to work are being locked up. And over that, you're facing checkpoints, and then coronavirus came, and they were having even more blackouts. So the medication and the doctors that were moved online, suddenly because of those curfews and those blackouts, there's lack of information being spread. So those appointments that were moved online were completely cut off because of these curfews and blackouts. And additional to that, the restriction of medical aid coming into Kashmir, that's occupied by India, was again restricted. Why? Because they've been labeling everyone that's trying to help people in occupied Kashmir as terrorists, and this tactic is being used to dehumanize Kashmiris living in Kashmir. And over that, people with disabilities in Kashmir are being accused of committing crime they physically cannot do. And over that, and this tactic is being used to keep everyone on toes that, yes, we can make you disabled by injuring you, and then we can accuse you of crime. And this is being done under the Public Safety Act. And even if in a public gathering, more than 4 people gather, and this is, again, they don't have access to electricity, that can be cut out anytime. And again, buildings are not accessible. So 3 to 4 people will be carrying a disabled person, and they can be shot down because there's more than 4 people gathering.
Yeah.
And this is continuously happening and injuring disabled people within Kashmir. So again, they're being attacked and being made disabled, and then they're being restricted to healthcare. And over that, whoever tries to help them gets attacked too. And then they're being labeled that they are committing crime, they're throwing rocks and pellets. Then how can a disabled person throw pellets and throw rocks onto police when they are physically not able to do that? Yeah. So they're being accused of crimes they never committed. And even though we can clearly see that, somehow the international community is not looking into that.
Yeah. Maysoon, I wanted to just as an example, of course, talk about, trying to find the man's name here, Iyad al-Halaq, if I'm saying his name correctly, which I'm sure you're very well aware of this case, but he was on his way to volunteer at a special needs school in Jerusalem's Old City. This happened on May 30th last year, and he had autism, I believe. He was a Palestinian man, and he was killed by Israeli forces during that interaction with the Israeli forces. I'm using that just an example as to how the occupying forces then deal with those with disabilities, be it autism or a whole range of other disabilities. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are much like here in the United States. People with disabilities are disproportionately affected by violence. So I live in the United States. I'm Palestinian. I can't live there. I live in the US. 50% of all people killed in the United States by law enforcement are disabled. So when we think of this moral army, the Israeli army, that's called the most moral army in the world, the only democracy in the Middle East, we would assume that they do not target children, that they do not target disabled centers. But in this latest siege of Gaza, the Hamed Disabled Rehabilitation Center was bombed. Children with autism, autistic children were evacuated in the middle of the night to no shelters. There is no Iron Dome. There is nothing to protect them. So if you're a Palestinian and an Israeli soldier occupying your land tells you to stop and you do not, they will kill you. But if you're deaf, maybe you didn't hear and you can't comply. If you're autistic, maybe in that moment you couldn't process it. If you're intellectually disabled, maybe you couldn't process it. If you have just abject fear as a non-disabled child, maybe you can't process it. So there's absolutely nothing that protects disabled Palestinian civilians. And when we're told, at least the Israeli army warns people so that they can evacuate. How do you evacuate if your child is on a ventilator? How do you do that? Where do you go when there's no shelter? So I think that as we fight for equality worldwide, regardless of faith, we must prioritize the human rights of disabled people, and it is simply not a priority.
Okay, so now let's get into specifics if we can. Both of you are, of course, disability rights advocates, as well as, of course, with your other careers that you have. I wonder what, in your opinion, Nawaal, is the most important challenge that disabled peoples within occupied territories face? Is it healthcare? Is it education, employment? I mean, I imagine it's a combination of all of the above.
I think one of the biggest things is that I think education is very important, because how can you know that you are being, because, you know, like children in Gaza and Gaza or in Kashmir, to them, they're so used to, they think this is normal. They think this is a normal environment. And for them, you know, for us, we learned that this is wrong. We learned that we have human rights. But to them, they think this is an everyday situation. They think that everyone living outside deals with the same thing, right? And especially, I want to bring in that the Gen Z, like especially millennials between Palestine and Kashmir, have grown up under occupations, right? And they need, essentially, they need education. They need that knowledge to go, whether they continue being in Palestine or leave their country. They need education, and education is under attack. I think that's one of the main priorities first, so they're able to know how to defend themselves, where to reach out, where to have access, and this is all done by education, and that is under attack. It is a combination. Healthcare is very important. So, you know, with all of these combinations, I feel like the first is we need to protect the right to education, protect education from attack. And this is what I will always stand for. But yes, I wanted to bring Maysoon into the conversation
Yeah, Maysoon, I know that you have worked, as I mentioned earlier as well, with disabled children in occupied Palestine. Do you agree that it is education which is the priority? I mean, I don't want to, you know, downplay the other aspects too. They're just as equally important. Healthcare is also extremely important when it comes to assistive devices as well.
I completely agree with Nawaal. And when I ran Maysoon's Kids, the entire point of the program was to mainstream disabled children into the Palestinian education system. Education is survival. I tell this story, and I will tell it quickly. When my parents went to enroll me in school in America, the school rejected me, and they wanted to send me to a school for children with Down syndrome. And if my parents hadn't fought for my education, I wouldn't be talking to you today here. I wouldn't. So I do believe that education is number one, but I broaden that to include therapies and services. So part of education is making sure that people have everything from speech therapy to mental health care. And those services are just as necessary as our access to education.
And then, you know, and something that has been alluded to, I believe Maysoon mentioned earlier, is in these occupied territories, obviously, we know that just in general terms as well, upon those people that live in these regions, there is various forms of persecution already happening, right? So I would think that disabled peoples feel that a lot more, that it affects them a lot more, and then it hurts their respective mental health a lot more. Am I right to say that?
Of course, I think that it's a it's a, you know, you're already dealing with so much mental stress, and only that having physical and lack of access to places. And I think one of the things to bring in that when it comes to people don't realize that even in Kashmir, it's the only Muslim majority area in India. And to make it a more Hindu majority, they're bringing in basically settlers into areas where, and one of the specific things, I was speaking to Kashmiris that live in the occupied side. They said that places that were accessible are suddenly turned into resorts or given into another majority. And so people who had that access to enter places are suddenly cut off because those places are being turned into resorts, vacation places for basically settlers, right? And to turn it to create a disproportionate balance. So places in Kashmir that are accessible to the communities are very strong. I think people don't realize that people within these areas, the community support is actually very strong, and they would flourish if they had access to, you know, education, healthcare, and all of that is being restricted because settlers are coming in and taking away the native land. And I think this is a very shared sentiment between Kashmiris and Palestinians, that the things that are up to date are being taken away from us, either by strikes, occupation, or settlers taking it away. And to keep that in mind, that and I think one of the other things to bring in, that a lot of the Kashmiris and Palestinians, just the millennials, you know, they grew up in a politically motivated violence and government-led oppression on them. Yeah. So that's why we're so aware of the struggles in between, and, you know, and what's going on with the current situation.
Maysoon, when we talk about Israel, we talk a lot about international law, right? So I'm speaking in general terms here for a moment, where the occupying power has, within international law, certain responsibilities towards the occupied peoples. And that's, again, as I said, enshrined in international law. I would think that that should also include, should it not, the rights of disabled peoples? Because, I mean, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine that for Israelis who are disabled, and I'm not saying they shouldn't have access to good healthcare or opportunities and freedoms, etc. But I would imagine that their healthcare, their education is significantly better than those who are Palestinian, and then that double standard on the same land essentially is quite drastic.
It's referred to as medical apartheid. So, like, for example, Israel was held up as a beacon for the vaccine. Every scientist that went on TV said, look what Israel's doing, look what Israel's doing. But Israel was also denying access to the vaccine to the Palestinian population. That's medical apartheid. Children with cancer in Gaza cannot access state-of-the-art treatment in Palestinian hospitals. We're not even asking for the Israeli hospitals, and Palestinian hospitals in Jerusalem, because they're not given a visa by Israel to get out of Gaza and get the treatment in Ramallah or Jerusalem. So medical apartheid is absolutely a real thing. And meanwhile, the oppressors have socialized healthcare. Everything is accessible. You know, I'm Palestinian, but I'm American. So I go everywhere from Haifa to Nazareth to Jerusalem to Dedwan. And when you see the difference in accessibility from a refugee camp in the West Bank to Haifa, it's like the difference between, you know, going from Ecuador to America. And so medical apartheid is absolutely real. It is under international law their duty to protect the civilian population. But unfortunately, the Convention for the Rights of People with Disabilities has never been signed. And that convention does need to be signed in order for disabled people to specifically be protected under international law.
Very well. Yeah,
I'm a downer, but I swear I'm a comedian.
No, I mean, I'm very, very glad you brought up these points, Maysoon and Nawaal. Unfortunately, has gotten the best of us, but we really, really appreciate both of you taking your time out this Saturday to join us. Really important conversation. I know we've probably just touched the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this issue, but I'm glad we were able to make this work and discuss these issues out. Maysoon there was speaking to us from New York, and Nawaal was speaking to us today from Doha. We were speaking about, as I said, disability challenges within occupied territories, such as specifically in this case, Kashmir and Palestine. Maysoon has worked on the ground in occupied Palestine, and she was speaking about her experiences and what she saw there, as well as, overall the challenges for disabled peoples within Palestine. And then, Nawaal was able to shed light for us about what happens in occupied Kashmir as well, vis-a-vis disabled people's rights, healthcare, education, freedoms as a whole, access to a whole host of therapies and assistance that they need to be able to then succeed in life, as is their right to do so. And then, of course, there's the mental trauma that everybody goes through, by the way, even those who are able-bodied, so to speak, and are not disabled. But then it's that much worse for somebody who's disabled, because then their access is anyways limited to many of those services. I'm glad we were able to make this work, and hopefully we'll be able to continue this conversation at a later date here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss President Joe Biden of the United States and his upcoming trip to Europe. We know that relations between Europe and the United States went through a bit of a cool period, or a cooling period, if I may use that phrase. While Donald Trump was in office, he did call out European leaders such as Angela Merkel and others, specifically when it came to the context of NATO defense spending, as well as a whole host of other issues that we can probably list and we will discuss with our panelists who are joining us today. Will Biden be able to repair those ties, so to speak, or have relations between the two sides changed irreversibly? Is that a good or a bad thing? Europe, for example, does want the United States to go back into the Iran nuclear deal as well. Under Donald Trump, there was a disagreement about that, certainly, but now with Biden in office, possibly there's agreement on that issue as well. But again, then there are other issues which the two sides still very much disagree on. So we can possibly then point to Nord Stream 2, the Russian gas pipeline, which is meant to then provide energy to Germany. There has been threat of sanctions in the past, so the Biden administration has so far waived those sanctions. And then we can possibly talk about trade and other such imbalances that then exist between these relations. Will Biden be able to smooth all of the above over? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Michael Lane, who is a political analyst. He's also the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. He's joining us now from Corolla, North Carolina. Joining us from Houston, Texas this morning is Joe Flemming, who is the director at Strafe Risk Management. And joining us from Paris is Dr. Gardner, who is a professor of history and politics at the American University of Paris. Hall, Joe, and Michael, thank you to all three of you for taking your time out this Saturday to join us. Hall, let me start with you. Give us, if you can, the European perspective, do you think, on the Americans and the relationship with the United States right now? Has it all just, been forgotten? Has the Trump era simply been forgotten now that Biden is in office? Or do you think lessons were learned and that things have now changed in the two sides' relations?
I think there's a cautious optimism about Biden. I mean, at least Biden ideologically is for multilateralism. He wants to bring the Europeans on board on a number of decisions. And yet they're still a bit wary of traditional American unilateralism and the Americans just going ahead. And I mean, the very fact that Biden announced that he would talk to Putin really wasn't talked to by the Europeans. So Biden really didn't explain that or go into any depth about what he was going to do or talk about with Putin. So that was a little bit of a surprise. It wasn't a big surprise, but it was something that the Europeans would like to be more involved in American decision making. They proposed a really in-depth U.S.-EU dialogue, and they want to see a really closer U.S. relationship and with EU-U.S. relationship. And I think Biden is on the right path for that. But As you mentioned before, the NATO issue. Biden's going to be much nicer about approaching NATO than Trump was. I mean, getting NATO members to spend more. He'll speak softly, but he'll still make the same demands as every other president before Trump had made. So that's one issue. The next issue is autonomy. To what degree will the Europeans have a relative autonomy vis-a-vis NATO? French President Macron wants a pretty clear European Union autonomy, and he believes that's more possible now that the UK has left the European Union. On the other hand, the Germans are more want a lesser autonomy than the French.
Joe, what are your thoughts on what the relationship will be like going forward? I mean, of course, there's a lot that the two sides have vis-a-vis mutual interest, but then there's a lot as well that challenge these relations going forward.
Yeah, I think the worldview between the two remains closely aligned, but at the same time, I think the U.S. is taking the position today that it's really always taken, that it differs from Trump. But the Europeans were in hope that there would be a partnership. I think the U.S. is certainly taking the position that we want to work with the Europeans, but we want to be leading that show. Whether it's interactions with Russia, you see some sanctions in Eastern Europe in the past week from the U.S., whether it's Nord Stream, whether it's trade issues. As much as the relationship is back on track, I think in a lot of ways, you saw U.S. sanctioning and then suspending, or putting tariffs and then suspending the tariffs against the European Union as it relates to EU taxes on American technology companies. I think the Europeans aren't going to be happy with everything, but I think both sides, there's a motivation to continue working together and bringing the relationship back to a better place than it was under the Trump administration.
Michael, I was just the other day watching a video about Trump and how he addressed many NATO leaders when he had met them during his tenure, of course, in the White House. And he was quite harsh with them, quite straightforward with them, especially when it came to defense spending, saying that a lot of them were just sort of, living off of, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, his words right now, U.S. Contributions to NATO, et cetera. And I don't want to just hone in on the NATO fact, but I mean, Trump was very different in how he dealt with even those who are understood as traditional allies. But as something that Hall there mentioned, do you think it's in fact just that Biden will possibly continue the same policies, but with just a nicer veneer?
Well, okay, so let's separate that into two different questions, which is, Trump the person and the personality, and then Trump the policy. On Trump the personality, he was very abrasive. He intentionally, I think, came across that way in an effort to carry forward his business demeanor to the international political stage, trying to convince people that, hey, I'm serious. I'm very serious. I'm in charge. And we're going to do this my way. Now, there's room around the edges to nibble a little bit, but essentially, follow me or get out of my way. Joe Biden is not like that at all. He's a likable guy on the international stage. He is, as was previously mentioned, more of a multilateralist by far than Donald Trump ever thought of being. One wonders sometimes whether he had ever learned the word multilateral, the way he had his America First agenda on the international stage. But then you go to the policies of Trump, and there are things here where the United States and Europe absolutely agree. We've previously mentioned the United States not only leading militarily but financially leading NATO, and Donald Trump's rather high-profile public campaign to call out European countries who had not contributed their fair share. This has been a longstanding goal of the United States since NATO was created, and the Europeans have, quite honestly, been riding on the American defense coattails. And Donald Trump, maybe he didn't do it the right way, but he correctly called them out, as has every other president since the inception of NATO. But the difference was Donald Trump actually got results with his abrasive, very public approach to the whole whole thing, whereas no other president had gotten any results throughout the course of the history of NATO, just about. There are other things such as the tariffs that were laid on the European Union and then suspended, the pipeline that you mentioned, Waqar, from Russia to Germany. So there are some policy issues, but I think being a multilateralist, Joe Biden is more or less going to be the reincarnation, foreign policy-wise, of the Obama administration, which is, work with them in private. If you don't see eye to eye and they want to do it, then the United States is going to go along with the way Europe wants things done for the most part. There was a joke. I don't know how accurate it was here in the United States, but there was a joke during the Obama administration that Obama had ceded the leadership of the free world to Angela Merkel. I don't think that was actually the case, but it was close enough that Obama was perfectly willing to step off the leaders' podium, and I think that's what we'll see from Biden.
Okay, so I'm glad you mentioned Merkel there, Michael, because Hall, I wanted to go to you with that, and I wanted to bring in the elephant in the room, at least right now, when it comes to relations between two sides, and that is the NSA spying scandal, which continues. It's not the beginning of it, just as we've gotten news of recent about NSA spying and how Denmark even helped the NSA spy on the likes of Merkel and others. I know that in and of itself, spying, I would think, even amongst allies probably does happen, but it's just not discovered in this fashion necessarily or outed this publicly. How important is that, or is that even, in fact, let me put it this way, a factor in the relations between the two sides?
Well, the Europeans have accused the Americans of spying, industrial spying, for quite a while, and of course these new revelations are part of the game. Everybody's spying on everybody right now, and the electronic world, the new digital world, allows you to do that much easier than perhaps in the past. Where you had to have men on the ground more so. I still think you need men on the ground, but men and women doing the spying. But certainly electronic eavesdropping has become the big fad. I think it's expected. On the other hand, I just wanted to take comment on the previous thing about Trump. One thing Trump did that no other president done, he actually threatened to leave NATO altogether. And I think that created a real backlash in Europe. And plus the spying, the idea that the United States is going to do it for a greater European autonomy. And I think that's why Macron has been pushing a European autonomy. But the Germans, despite the spy scandal, NSA spy scandal, are more reluctant to develop an autonomous defense. I think there are ways for the Europeans to actually contribute more to defense if they could pool their resources together, but they haven't been able to do that. And that's where Macron falls apart. He can't get the rest of the Europeans to go along with him. Nevertheless, I think there is a resentment in Europe about American spying, about American domination in NATO, and that they want to have a more autonomous policy, particularly towards Russia and the Mediterranean. And that's been in the background of European politics for quite a while, but I think it's going to come out even under Biden here. I don't think Biden's going to be able to assert NATO the way previous presidents have. So I don't quite see him as Obama beast. I really see he's going to have new problems, and he's really going to have to deal with Russia very differently. Biden himself did try to reset. It's not in the news, but he was one of the main people behind the reset in 2008. And I wouldn't be surprised if he tries again, despite the tensions at present.
Let's talk about Russia if we can then, Joe, because on the Russia point, obviously for the Europeans, and Nord Stream 2 is an example of that, of course, that the Europeans are a lot closer, obviously, strategically to Russia as well. So if anything does happen untoward when it comes to Russia, then it affects the Europeans a lot more than it does the Americans in that sense, simply because of, geographical distance. But do you think that the Americans and the Europeans will forever then remain divided on how to then approach Russia, with the Americans possibly always wanting a stronger approach?
I think it depends on the issue. I think as far as things like Ukraine, some of the other countries in Eastern Europe, the Europeans will get behind some of the U.S. sanctions, some of the push to prohibit Russian influence or reduce Russian influence in the region. Even going so far as some new NATO members potentially. But at the end of the day, I think the reality is the Europeans rely on Russian gas. You see it in Germany. There's a reason there's a hesitance to join in with the U.S. and ban Nord Stream 2, because it's a massive supply of cheap energy. If there was an alternative to that, I think it'd be a whole different story. But I think the Europeans also have taken a fairly realist approach to Russia, that, yeah, they're an aggressor in some areas, like Ukraine. There's a lot of things around hacking and cyber espionage and various nefarious activity in different places like Libya. But at the same time, are we any closer to a war in Europe with Russia? No, probably not. Are you going to put at risk the European economy that relies on Russian energy? No, probably not. But again, I think there's areas where we'll see eye to eye. Probably places like Ukraine, things around human rights. Belarus is another one that are a focus of the Biden administration. I think the Europeans can get on board, but how far that'll go, we'll have to see.
What are your thoughts on the Russia factor? As I said, Russia seems to be a point of both division and unity when it comes to the Americans and Europeans.
Yes. Every American president thinks they have some sort of special capability of getting along with Putin and creating a special relationship that will lead to a better outcome. And every American president is disappointed in the end. Donald Trump has the most widespread and most severe sanctions against Russian and Russian individuals of any administration in the world, or any administration in the history of the United States. And yet President Putin continues to do his thing, which is, from the American point of view, being a very disruptive actor on the world stage. President Biden will think that he can have this upcoming summit with Putin, and they can look each other in the eyes and they can reach an understanding and agreement, and everything won't be sweetness and light, but certainly everything will be much better than it is today. I don't think that's in President Putin's interest, and I don't think it's on his agenda. And so I think President Biden is being somewhat naive to think that he can go there and come out with a better outcome than things are today. As far as the Europeans and the Americans cooperating on their approach to Russia, there are clearly some issues, such as energy, where the issues diverge. But for the most part, that cooperation is through NATO. It is an organization that was established to counter Russian aggression. It does so in the macro sense very, very well. In the micro sense, I would suggest not at all. You look at Ukraine, Crimea, et cetera. Okay, so Ukraine is not a full-fledged member of NATO, but certainly these are areas where NATO could have had a little bit more of a reaction and resistance, and it essentially did nothing. So I think President Putin continues to do what he does, which is in his interest. And NATO and the European American axis say things that are sounding very good on the world stage, but I think the actions will result in Putin doing what he wants.
Another huge issue, and we've spoken about this just in general terms, but I wanted to hone in on this for a moment, is trade between the two sides, right? So we've had the EU trade chief just a few weeks ago talking about how the US needs to remove tariffs on EU steel and aluminum imports. We know that tariffs were used as his weapon of choice by Donald Trump while he was in office. Do you think that trade will become better between the two sides? I mean, the US made that point very publicly to its partners as well as its foes about trade imbalances that it had with many entities around the world. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's a positive aspect of this, and both sides are pretty much agreed to work through the World Trade Organization to try to resolve some of these disputes. So this would get it into an international organization, that one of Biden's themes being multilateralism, to deal with these. I think agricultural trade is really the big issue. The Europeans don't want chlorinated chicken and other American farm products coming to Europe, and that's been a big clash there. I think the steel one is relatively easier to manage, but there's other aspects, and that's tax policy, and Biden, by at least promising to tax some of the GAFA and the big digital companies, we might see some greater cooperation in the way we approach the big companies, as well as I said, reducing tariffs on steel and other items. My view is that agriculture is going to be still going to be a sticking point.
Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us. We really, really appreciate Hall, Joe, and Michael for taking their time out to speak to us today and for sharing their thoughts with us on Biden's upcoming visit to Europe. He's set to hit some very, very important hotspots across Europe, the UK included. And of course, on his agenda, as we would imagine, is a more multilateral approach to try to smooth things over that were possibly spoiled or challenges were created during the Donald Trump tenure because he was a lot more abrasive, if I may borrow a term that Michael had used as well in one of his answers. Donald Trump wasn't completely always wrong about the issues that the U.S. has with Europe, but he was just a lot more politically incorrect about the way he dealt with them. Biden probably will still stick by the U.S. complaint about NATO defense spending and that European partners are still not doing enough vis-a-vis their defense budgets spending on NATO expenditure. But then there's a whole host of other issues, as we've mentioned in introduction, Nord Stream 2, and our guests also referred to that gas pipeline. So there are issues that need to be smoothed over, and will Biden be able to do that successfully? We'll, of course, have to wait and see. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.